Spring is in the air. The Poe Museum's enchanted garden is abloom. It's April, depending on when you're watching this, and that means it's National Poetry Month. So we'll have an especially poetic episode of the Curator's Crypt. So how do you experience poetry? Most of us are forced to read it in high school and never look at it again. But in Poe's day, people actually enjoyed poetry. They read it to each other at night to entertain their families. They even paid to go to poetry readings. If you were lucky enough, you could attend one of Edgar Allan Poe's readings. They said that his Raven rendition was just spellbinding. And for a fortunate few, he'd actually perform the Raven at their home. People also exchanged poetry, wrote poetry. They were crazy about poetry, and they even kept albums to write poetry to each other. Kind of like today's high school yearbooks, except a lot more poetic. So let's take a quick look at some of the poetry albums in our collection. Now, this is something really special. This is the autograph album of Lucy Dorothea Henry. She's the granddaughter of Patrick Henry, who's the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," back during the Revolutionary War. And because of her famous grandfather, she was able to write people and ask, "Can I have a sample of your handwriting? Can you send me one of your poems?" And she was able to make contact with some of the greatest writers of her day. And she's got a little bit of everybody in here. She's got a who's who of famous writers from her time, including Charles Dickens, Washington Irving, and of course, 3 documents by Edgar Allan Poe. But there's about 396 documents in all in this little album. And not just documents. Here's one of my favorite pieces. This is a pressed flower taken from the grave of romantic British poet John Keats in 1854. So along the way, she met some of the great writers and editors of the day. We even have people she never met, like William Wordsworth is included in here. But one of the people she did meet was John Keats, who is an editor and publisher in New York City. He published an annual called The Opal, which contained the first printing of Edgar Allan Poe's story, Tale on the Wissahickon. You never heard of that? That's okay. You can read it right now. But eventually, John Keats gave her a gift of a poetry album. Take a look. He inscribed it right in here. Presented by Mr. J. Keats to Miss Lucy D. Henry, December 25th, 1844. And he was able to get some of his friends to write poetry in her albums. So she got some poetry from some of the best known poets of her time. Not necessarily people who are still read today. But there's a poem over here from Nathaniel Parker Willis, who was the highest paid writer in America at the time. And also some poems over here from Charles Finno Hoffman. To give you an idea how big Hoffman was, people used to call him the American Byron. And in the 1842 anthology, The Poets and Poetry of America, there were 47 of his poems in it. More than any other poet in the book. Edgar Allan Poe only got 3 poems in that book. So Hoffman was a big deal here. Although Poe thought that he was guilty of the greatest crime of all, imitation or plagiarism. He said the only reason that people liked Charles Finno Hoffman's poetry is because they actually liked the poets he was imitating. So that's Lucy Henry's poetry album. Here's another piece. I've shown you this before. This is actually the juvenile companion It's a gift book. And Poe gave this in 1836 to Miss Louisa Ann Lynch. She was a girl, about 11 years old, who lived down in Petersburg, Virginia. That's about 30 miles south of Richmond. And he's inscribing here his tiny, tiny handwriting to Miss Louisa Ann Lynch with the compliments of her sincere friend Edgar A. Poe. And then way back here, on page 67, he inscribed it once again in his teeny tiny handwriting a second time to L.A. Lynch. Now, we don't know why he made that second inscription other than he wrote it in the middle of a story in which they mention a raven. So maybe it's some kind of inside joke where he's referencing that raven. But by the time the raven came out, she would have been married and her last name would have been Deeden, not Lynch. So this is something he would have written before the raven came out. Now I show you that because we have another piece. The same donor, her granddaughter, gave both of these pieces to the Poe Museum in her will back in 1978. And this is Louisa Lynch's poetry album. And some of the poems in here are dated from the mid-1830s, so about the same time as that book over there. But since it was in her will, the granddaughter wasn't alive to tell us why she gave the museum this in addition to the one with Poe's handwriting in it. As you look through, there's several poems in various handwriting, usually signed with initials, but then every once in a while, you'll see a little engraving, and underneath it, in teeny tiny handwriting, which reminds me a little bit of the handwriting in that book, there'll be little quotes from Shakespeare or other poets. Here's one right here, to Nanny, which I guess was a nickname for Louisa Ann Lynch. Her voice was gentle, soft, and low, an excellent thing in woman. And here's one right in the frontispiece. This is a very cheerful message to write in the front of somebody's album. Faith throws a bridge across the sea of death and lands hope on the farther shore. So is that the kind of message that you'd write in somebody's poetry album or maybe somebody's high school yearbook? So take a closer look. Do you think that it's possible that Edgar Allan Poe could have written these inscriptions? So let us know down in the comments. Do you think this is Edgar Allan Poe's handwriting or not? Is it a Poe or a no? Well, it's not such a far-fetched thing because Poe did write poetry in the albums of different people in his life. In fact, some of his best-known poems weren't meant to be published. Think of Alone, from childhood's hour, I've not been as others were, I've not seen as others saw. That poem was not published during Poe's lifetime. It was found 26 years after his death in one of his friend's poetry albums. And we have such a poetry album right here. This belonged to Amelia Poe, his cousin. Amelia Poe was the twin sister of Edgar's cousin, Nelson Poe. Nelson Poe married his cousin, Josephine Clem, whose half-sister was Edgar and Nelson and Amelia's cousin, Virginia Clem. You got it? And this album is full of poetry, usually signed with initials or they're anonymous. Sometimes there's really nice drawings. And here's a press leaf from the 1820s. And check out this drawing, the doves right there. Underneath it says, Amelia Poe. Right here, he wrote, Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, which gently o'er the perfume see the weary, wayworn traveler board to his own native shore, and signed it E.A.T. I tend to lean toward this being 1829. Poe first published the poem in 1831, and by that time he'd expanded it from one stanza to three stanzas, and made some other little changes, like here where it says traveler, he changed it to weary, wayworn wanderer. Better alliteration that way. So this might just be a very early draft of Poe's poem To Helen. In fact, the only copy of To Helen that survives in Poe's handwriting. So good piece to have here. So why don't you take a look at some of the poetry albums in your family's collection and see if maybe, just maybe, there's a Poe poem hidden away in there somewhere. If you don't have any of your own poetry albums from the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, why not support the Poe Museum in preserving these precious Poe pieces? Just visit our website today at poemuseum.org to find out how to contribute, to become a member, or you can become a patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. So thanks for joining us today, and I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cat yawning.